Okay, well, it's Holly Richardson and John Dougal today, Frugal Dougal. So thank you for joining me in studio.
It's great to be with you.
We have news from the Middle East today, of course. There's 20 hostages. The remaining living hostages have been released. And
after 2 years.
This
is amazing news.
Yeah, 2 years and about a week. Yeah, so that's exactly right. And President Trump spoke to the Israeli parliament earlier today.
Today, the skies are calm, the guns are silent, the sirens are still, and the sun rises on a holy land that is finally at peace.
So it's one of the things, like, what does that make you think? We've seen pictures all morning of the reunions, right, of these hostages going back to their families.
Well, it's one of those things, think back to October 7th, 2 years ago, and it's just a tragic event. I can't imagine the sadness, the horror that these families have felt over these years, and finally getting their loved family members back.
Yeah.
And the possibility of peace in the Middle East. Who would have imagined?
Yeah, well, I'm sure they were praying for that for this whole time, right? And working towards it, of course. And that's one of the issues, of course, that has been in the news for the last 2 years is what is happening with those hostages. And I think if I remember the number right, it was about 251 people that were taken hostage on October 7th that were living at the time when they were taken. And now 2 years later, a variety were released at several different points. This is, I think, the fourth hostage release, but the final one.
The final one of those that are living. There will be over time those that have passed away.
That's right.
That will be
that's right.
turned
So
over.
We actually have that ABC News chief international correspondent, James Longman, spoke to the people who have died.
We've had hostage releases before, of course, but I think now the world understands that the hostage ordeal for the Israelis is over. Although I have to say there's still a question about the remains of Israelis killed in captivity. We're not sure that all of them will be recovered today.
So we have a guest with us today. He's Amos Guiora. He's a professor at the S.J. Quinney College of Law at the University of Utah, and he literally was on the plane home from Israel when he heard this news. Can you tell us, Amos, what were your feelings?
I think most of us were sound asleep, probably with half an ear and half an eye waiting for the announcement. And when the pilot came on the air, you could tell from his first words and from his voice that what he was going to share with us. And we obviously all broke into a round of applause. And then as soon as he finished with the Hebrew, he went into English, obviously, because not everybody speaks Hebrew. And there are no words. And indeed, it's now, I'm in Los Angeles, it's 8 a.m. here. It's at 6 p.m. in Israel. All 20 living hostages have been returned. There are 28 murdered hostages. Use the phrase passed away. They didn't pass away. They were murdered. And the deal is all-inclusive because we don't distinguish in Israel between alive and dead hostages. And Hamas's obligation is to return the 28 killed hostages, murdered hostages, in order for us to give them a proper burial. As of, I just checked now while waiting to come on the air with you, that only 4 of the 28 have been returned. I know that yesterday at least 2 families were told that their loved ones won't be returned because their bodies have not been found. There will be challenges in finding all the bodies. There's also going to be challenges in identifying the bodies. And I remind all of us that last year, I think it was last year or it was this year, I don't remember, I apologize, Hamas claimed to have returned a killed hostage, and then when the identification process was over, it was a ruse. They returned someone else who wasn't at all a hostage. The 24 families whose loved ones were murdered, whether soldiers in the IDF or at the music festival, there is a deal being made between us and them, us being society. When I was at the rally Saturday night with 500,000 people, loudly booing Netanyahu and applauding President Trump, the hostage family said the following, and they're right. We need to embrace the 20 who are returned today, yes, but we need to keep coming back to Hostage Square in Tel Aviv until all 28 are returned. Now, we've been through this before. In 1986, an Israeli airman, Ron Arad, was shot down. He was a navigator. 39 years later, his family still has not received his body from Lebanon, Iran, whoever you want to, hold responsible for it. So for us, it's not enough to have the 20 alive returned. Fabulous, great, overwhelming, no words. But, now attention is directed to the 28 whose bodies must be returned because that's the agreement. And my instinct tells me that President Trump is going to hold, I don't know, it's Qatar, Egypt, Hamas, responsible for this.
You talked about cheering of Trump and booing of Netanyahu. What is this doing for Trump on the global stage, and overall, what is this doing for Netanyahu on the global stage?
So I leave the global stage to people like you. I'm so focused on life in Israel. But there was a clear sense that without President Trump, I think the correct expression in English is ramrodding this down Netanyahu's throat. None of this would have ever happened. Netanyahu had a clear interest in continuing this purposeless war for his electoral purposes only. And there was no purpose in this war at all. He needed this for his political survival. The booing, which I understand has caught on enormous worldwide attention, it reflects what many of us feel about Netanyahu, who made no effort to bring the hostages home. And it's absolutely remarkable. It was when Trump's representative, Steve Witkoff, spoke at the rally, the ovations for Trump were heartfelt. I participated in a march earlier this summer to the American embassy, consulate embassy in Tel Aviv, calling on Trump to be the one to act, and he ultimately did, because we understood as Israelis that the social contract had been broken between the government and us, because the government had made the deliberate decision, I emphasize deliberate decision, to abandon the hostages for its own political purposes. And us Israelis are grateful to President Trump for making this deal happen. Without him, this doesn't happen.
First step
the obvious question. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, first step is exchanging living and murdered hostages and those prisoners of war on the other side. What needs to happen next, and can we get down those further steps to peace?
Absolutely. So the next step is, I think it's today, tomorrow, that President Trump and the other world leaders are convening in Sharm el-Sheikh. Muslim leaders, Arab country leaders, Middle East country leaders. Netanyahu studies going. I saw now that Erdogan of Turkey forced Trump to renege on Netanyahu's coming, but that I want to be careful with because it's so many different sources. That's going to begin the step two of what we call in Hebrew the day after. Because at the end of the day, Gaza needs to be rebuilt. Gaza at the moment probably looks a little bit like Dresden after the Second World War. There are, Palestinian civilians who need to have their lives put back together. We Israel also need our lives put back together. I don't know if you know, but I spent 15 years of my life negotiating implementation of the Oslo peace process. So I understand implementation of agreements. This is going to be hard, really, really, really hard. And nobody should think to themselves, 28 hostages back. I mean, hopefully 28 released, 20 home, 28 bodies on their way. The next steps are going to be long, hard, difficult, drawn out. But if we are all understanding that there is no plan B with a ceasefire, and Trump is right. I sat outside we live outside Jerusalem. I sat outside on our deck Saturday or Friday or Saturday. I'm sorry, I don't remember which day. And there were no planes over my head. There were no helicopters over my head. There were no air raid sirens. It was quiet. That's what normalcy is. Yesterday I went to a basketball game. The hope is that we can use platform, maybe is a better word, this to slowly begin implementing the next steps, plural. But if anybody thinks this will be, a quick one and done or whatever the expression, that's not going to happen. This will be hard.
Yeah.
And it's essential that President Trump stay fully engaged because Netanyahu will use any opportunity to slide away.
Thank you so much for joining us. We've been speaking with Amos Guiora, and we'll continue our discussion on what's happening in Israel right now when we come back. But we have with us NewsNation's Washington's correspondent, Hannah Brandt, to talk to us about what's next. Thanks for joining us, Hannah.
Hi there.
So can you just set the stage for us? Like, how did this unfold, and what can we anticipate?
Well, really, it all came together very quickly. These negotiations are something we know the Trump administration has been working on for months and months. We've had Middle East Special Envoy Steve Witkoff kind of going back and forth with negotiations. And then just in really the past week, the past few days even, he and the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, kind of started to announce that this peace plan had been reached. It was reached and then agreed to by Hamas. All of that coming together really quickly, and the president deciding, hey, I'm going to hop on a plane, I'm going to get to the Middle East, and I'm going to give remarks to the Israeli parliament. That's called the Knesset. He did that earlier this morning and talked to Israel about kind of what he sees as a turning point for not only Israel, but the region. The president has said multiple times this war is over. He thinks that this really is a peace agreement that's going to last. But kind of to your point, we're really at phase one here, and that's the return of those hostages, the exchange of prisoners, and the ceasefire. And now the president says we start phase two. So he's in Egypt. He's going to be talking with the leader of Egypt, with his team, with those world leaders, and they're going to be having discussions about what's next, because there are still a lot of complicated questions on the table. This is obviously a really complex conflict in this region, and the ceasefire and the hostage exchange, that's really just the beginning of this discussion.
So talk to us about what's next. I mean, how difficult is it to get there, and what are those steps, and what does President Trump do, and what do the other leaders need to do?
I mean, it's obviously extremely difficult. You know, this conflict really has, I mean, you know, we just reached the 2-year anniversary of this war as we see it in this context, but the conflict has years and years of history behind it. And the president
some would say
even
millennia.
mentioned, yeah, right. And the president touched on that in his speech. You know, we've got the White House, his team, leaders all over acknowledging just how complicated of a situation this is. But they have to make some big decisions on things like how exactly Israel is going to withdraw fully from Gaza with its military forces, how they're going to be disarming Hamas and agree on that sort of an outline and timeline for when that happens. And then, of course, you've got the challenge of rebuilding Gaza. There's a lot of destruction in Gaza right now, and figuring out, furthermore, how exactly Gaza is going to be governed, and getting a plan that everyone agrees to, that everyone wants to sign on to, is going to certainly be a challenge. I mean, that's part of why they're having this peace summit there in Egypt today, so that world leaders can be part of those discussions, can weigh in on those issues. We've got President Trump really leading this effort himself, but of course, his special envoy, Steve Witkoff, says, you know, he's going to be a big part of these discussions. Jared Kushner, we're expecting to be engaged in kind of what's next. They said just minutes ago in a press conference that basically implementation of their peace plan has already begun. That's something they said that they were thinking of the moment the ink dried on this agreement. So certainly we know the White House is focused on kind of moving forward and what's next from here.
I have a question about Palestine and Gaza. Is there any discussion at all about a two-state solution?
From what we know of from the White House, that's not something we're really looped in on. I mean, they're letting kind of the president's remarks speak for themselves, and we're about to hear from him again in Egypt. He certainly, you know, there are a lot of questions that we're going to be hearing people ask him, but we've heard kind of the president make mixed remarks on that in the past.
So several folks are saying, but for Trump, this never would have happened. Talk to me about that. I mean, there's clearly America's divided. There's some that think Trump can do no wrong, and there's others that think he can do no right. Talk to me about Trump, his legacy, and how impactful he was in at least getting this first step and leading to the future steps.
Well, we know the White House has said that, and we've heard Trump himself say, look, I'm a deal maker. That's what I do. This war actually, in his view, wouldn't have even started if he was in office. That's what he says anyway. That's what the White House has been kind of highlighting, that only President Trump could have made this deal. We know he does have, you know, a deep relationship with the Prime Minister of Israel, Bibi Netanyahu, and that friendship goes back years and years. In President Trump's first term, we know that they were close, and they've had a lot of private discussions throughout this conflict, and he was, you know, a key part of getting Netanyahu to negotiate on some things, and that's certainly a relationship that played a part in this agreement. And we heard, you know, Israel and the leaders of Israel this morning, as they welcomed the president to their parliament, say multiple times they don't think that anyone else could have pulled this deal off. That's something we've heard world leaders giving credit to the president and his team, certainly basking in kind of that moment and saying, okay, well, trust us on these next steps too, because we've got a good idea of where this should go from here, and we want to lead on this peace process.
So I know it's really early days and a lot of discussion will have to happen, but is there any indication about who is going to end up paying for the rebuilding of Gaza?
Well, we've heard President Trump say there's a lot of wealth in the Middle East, and he believes there are Arab nations who can kind of foot the bill on that front. We've heard him say before he doesn't think the U.S. will be the ones or the U.S. taxpayers rather would be the ones footing the bill for this. That remains to be seen, whether other countries may pressure the U.S. to make some investment on this front. But the president kind of has been suggesting that this is, a Middle East problem to solve on the financial front, and that he wants to see Middle Eastern countries invest in this for, stability in their region.
Given Trump's success here, I'm going to pivot a little bit in the final minute and a half. Will this help Trump close a deal between Russia and Ukraine?
Well, Ukraine certainly hopes so. And we haven't heard from Russia, but, the Ukrainian president put out a statement in which he said, we're happy to see this peace happen. We hope that we're next. That's something they have been looking for President Trump's leadership on. And we're actually expecting the Ukrainian president to be here in Washington later in this week. And so we know he and President Trump have been having a lot of back and forth discussions about what comes next in this conflict. But we've seen President Trump sort of go back and forth on where he stands in that conflict in particular. He kind of started with his meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin and said, look, I think that Ukraine is going to have to cede some land. And then he said, never mind, maybe Ukraine can keep all of its land. And so that's sort of a really big unresolved issue in that conflict that the president has staked out a few different positions on, and we'll see kind of where he lands as those talks continue.
Thank you so much for joining us today. That was Hannah Brandt from NewsNation. She's the Washington correspondent. Look, it's just one of the it's interesting, right? I mean, I thought her point where it can happen so quickly, like it feels like there's no progress, and then all of a sudden it's like we've got a deal and the hostages are back, the living ones. And I think, it was interesting to hear Jared Kushner's name mentioned. I haven't heard his name since the first administration. And then I think to our previous guest, I think it was definitely Trump crammed this down the throat of Netanyahu to get this to happen. But there's something, right? There's got to be, at least he came to the table and he agreed. So